Welcome to the show with me, Dan, and my guest, Phil Legrand. Is it Legrand? Is that how you say it?
I guess it would actually be Legrand, but
Legrand.
yeah, I don't mind too much. You grow up with a surname like mine, living in the UK, you get all sorts of derivations of it.
Phil Legrand. It's a very Legrand name.
Yeah, it is. Unfortunately, I'm only 5'8". It didn't quite go with the genetics there, so I'll probably sell myself a bit short. Excuse the pun, but yeah, we'll call it 5'8".
Wicked. Well, I'll just for people listening, I'll just say quickly how it came about that you're on the show.
Sure.
I did a show maybe a few weeks ago that was released where I was doing like a political compass game with a friend of mine, and we came across a question that was in the economics section, and we both sort of were like two monkeys like debating like something that we had no idea about. I mentioned in it like it'd be great to speak to someone who knows a bit more about economics than we do. And then a mutual friend of ours or a family friend of mine and a friend of yours got in touch and said that you and recommended you for the show because of your background with finance and economics. So that's sort of a basic of how it came to be how it is now. So I guess we'll sort of start with that and sort of talk about a little bit about your background in terms of economics.
Sure. So I studied economics at university. That was my bachelor's degree, just straight economics, which I think, at the time I definitely grew up with an interest in it. My dad worked in banking for his whole life, so I think we kind of had a natural interest or mutual natural interest in it. I suppose on the flip side of that, I also thought that it would make me more employable than doing something else. So there's definitely two sides to it, but I do remain interested in the economy in general and how it affects our daily life, and also I think more importantly now, kind of looking at changing the economy. Or certainly our policymakers changing the economy to suit, I think, our requirements now versus what they were when a lot of these social constructs were invented, which in a lot of cases was the best part of 100 years, going on 100 years ago now. I definitely remain interested, but I did a master's in management, which kept me at university for one more year, mainly because it was very difficult to get a job. I graduated in 2009, which obviously was the probably the greatest economic event of our lifetimes, and maybe apart from right now, but definitely up there.
So was it actually? So was that climate then also not very good for people involved in finance either? Then
I think that a lot of businesses, I mean, definitely banking, right? Because that was the hardest hit sector, and rightly so, and we can definitely come on to why. I found it a little bit difficult. I also think that at the time I was possibly a little immature, and it was probably a good thing for me just to have another year at university, and I felt very ready by the end of that to leave. And then I went straight into the city after I left university, and became a sort of trainee financial advisor, which was pretty interesting. It was quite a fast-paced business, kind of all about generating your own clients, and that was really the kind of priority there. But I felt pretty confident and comfortable that my my background, if you like, my degree was going to help me in that.
Mm.
And then shortly after that, probably about 18 months or so, I got offered a job in Jersey, where I have a lot of family over here, Jersey and the Channel Islands, that is. I've been, on holiday here many times as a kid, and kind of felt nice and comfortable. So it was more so the move here than the job. I ended up at a bank, just doing some pretty menial lending work, and then I managed to secure a job at a much bigger bank, as a wealth manager, which is now kind of what I've been doing, going on. It's probably the best part of 6 years. It's just really advising clients on what to do with their money, what not to do with their money, and yeah, obviously that on a day-to-day basis is kind of all about distilling what's going on in the world, and what our views are as an institution, and trying to help clients in that specific regard.
So apart from the fact that your dad was a banker, like what do you? I guess it's more of a recent question as opposed to the initial reason for going into it. But like, what do you enjoy about your job and the jobs you've done over the years? Because I can imagine there's people out there who would be like, that sounds like the most boring thing. What do
Hopefully
you?
you're not one of them, right?
No, but I'm finding it very interesting. But yeah, what personal satisfaction or what do you enjoy about it? Whether it's on the whole or on the day-to-day sort of level.
I love the human interaction in what I do. I've moved out of directly advising clients before, and it wasn't something that I found a particularly natural affinity with. So I would say that is the kind of main bit that interests me. Hearing about people's stories is so fascinating to me. I come from a family with a pretty diverse background, and that's probably given me a lot of insight, a lot of ways to relate to a lot of different people. And my parents have lived all around the world, although I was brought up in the UK for the vast majority of my life. So I think that is definitely the main thing. And I also think there's a bit of a kind of competitive sport in what I do. I grew up playing a lot of sport, and if you ask any of my friends and my wife, I'd definitely be categorized as a competitive person in general. And when you are advising a client on what they need, it's obviously the first and foremost requirement is that you match up to what they're trying to achieve. That's absolutely the goal, and that gives me a lot of pleasure and enjoyment in managing to do that. But on the flip side of it, there's also a competition of I want to make sure that I'm taking this client through the full array of what we've got available to us in our kit locker, and how we can help them to get where they need to go, whilst getting me to also where I want to go as well. So I think that sort of sales element of what I was trying to avoid using the word sales, but it's difficult to do that. That element definitely gives me a lot of interest.
Okay, so it's also personal challenge as well. Like you have a lot
Yeah,
of different sort of challenges to come up with when you're sort of advising on particular things.
exactly.
Nice. Okay. Well, I think I might take it just to give a bit of context to what I referenced to before, the fact that I was discussing economics very briefly with someone in a previous podcast. I was wondering if I could put the thing to you, the statement that we debated very, very briefly,
Okay.
and see if you could just shed a bit of light. So this sort of, I guess, would be a bit more of a educational type thing of just like understanding what these words mean and how
Sure.
they relate to us, the average Joe and Jane on the ground. But basically the political compass is just an online sort of quiz where you get to see how you answer like 60 questions or whatever, and you see how left or right wing you are, how authoritarian or libertarian you are. And this, you're given statements, and then you say disagree, strongly disagree, agree, and strongly agree. So the one we were discussing was controlling inflation is more important than controlling unemployment. So that's controlling inflation is more important than controlling unemployment.
Interesting.
So we both really didn't know fully what inflation was. So my friend said unemployment. His sort of reasoning was that unemployment's bad, and we've got to have people employed. And I agreed with the statement that controlling inflation is more important, because my limited understanding of inflation is that it's sort of controlled centrally by Bank of England or whatever central bank is in the country, and that determines sort of like prices for things and like loans, like interest rates for loans and things like that. So I felt like it made more of a macro impact. It made more of a wider impact that would then trickle down, I guess, to the unemployment. But I don't know if you can shed a little light of our the clear confusion that we have over
Yeah, yeah, of course. I think there's a few bits to pick apart there, but I think the first thing that we should definitely do is define what inflation is. So inflation isn't something that we control. It's a product. So inflation would be the kind of sustained increase in prices of various things. Those things change depending on what measure of inflation you look at. There's something which is called the retail price index, RPI, which you might come across. There's other measures, indices that have been put together to better measure inflation, if you like, as life has moved on. So sometimes they effectively the measure is what is the price of a normal basket of goods and services at a given period of time. So
if a kilogram of apples it costs £1 1 year, and it costs £1.10 the next year, then the inflation is a 10% increase. Is that
exactly? So that is effectively, in very simple language, exactly what inflation is. So as I say, coming back to the point that I made right at the start, is that we don't have control over that itself, but we can do things to control it, or to try and control it,
influence it.
Exactly. So at the moment we have what is historically, certainly in the UK and in most Western developed economies, we have incredibly low inflation, and that's quite a surprising thing, because for the last I guess, what are we, 2020? So for the last 11, 12 years, we've had incredibly low interest rates. Historically, there has been a relationship between interest rates and inflation, which has meant that if inflation is going up and up and up, interest rates are a good way to control that. So they are in turn normally set higher and higher in order to try and bring the inflation back down, because what interest rates effectively do, or what they should do, and this is, I think, should is the kind of operative at the moment, it is influence people's habits. So where you see interest rates being very low, ordinarily you should see people going out and spending money and borrowing loads of money.
Mm.
And then what happens is that as people spend money, because the trade-off for that person is, well, let's say it's easy for us to relate to this now, but right now, what do you get on the high street for putting your money in a savings account? If you're fortunate enough to have savings, well, you pretty much get nothing at the moment. So the trade-off there is, well, either I put my money in the bank account and get nothing, or I go out and do something with it. I go and I invest it somewhere else. I go and I, do home improvements to my house. I buy a car, I buy clothes, consumer spending increases. And as that consumer spending increases, the theory would be that inflation should in turn increase. That has not been happening.
When people go out and spend more, they feed
Yeah,
more into the wider economy.
exactly.
And then why does inflation then go up? Why does the bunch of apples then go up? What is it? Because people because the supermarket that's selling them realizes that there's a high demand and therefore they can charge more?
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. So if you imagine you and I have both decided at the same time that we don't want to put our money in the bank, we want to go and spend it and buy an apple.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's two of us vying over the same apple.
Mm.
The supermarket's going to be able to charge more for the apple.
Mm.
So yeah, absolutely right.
Okay. So that's controlling inflation. So I mean, do you have an opinion on that statement then? The sort of controlling inflation is more important than controlling unemployment, or is it too complex an issue to really have an opinion on?
It is a very complex issue, and again, it would come back to what the economic theory has been. Normally, you would see an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So, what I mean by that is that as unemployment decreases and more people are working, inflation should increase. And that kind of comes back to, well, it does come back to exactly the point that we were just discussing. If you've got more people in employment, you should have more people with more disposable income, and therefore they should be going out and spending more money. Prices should go up, and inflation will therefore go up.
So why is inflation for the customer? Why is inflation a bad thing? Because the average person, if they're like, right, 90% of my community are employed, so that's good.
Yeah.
Well, let's just say 99% of my community are employed. That's all good. But apples, they've barely gone up at all. Like, why is that a bad thing, or why could it be a bad thing that inflation has barely budged?
Well, that's a really interesting point, actually, and an incredibly complex one. But
Mm.
it does kind of bring me onto a theory that I harbour, quietly, is that it is probably the case that although again, and I don't want to kind of tread on loads of very complex issues here, but it is important. As I said before, we've had 12 years of really, really low interest rates, which has meant that money's been super cheap. Borrowing has gone up inextricably, and it's I think you see the stats reported in the news about how much credit card debt the UK has. People have really been taking advantage of that.
So the main thing, sorry, just to interject, just the
Sorry,
main
go on.
things that
Yeah,
people borrow for is stuff like starting a business or
yeah.
building a house. It's not like the everyday stuff. It's more like big spending in the economy, is it?
Well, do you mean generally at the moment? Is that what
Well, like
people are doing?
I mean, like in general, sort of like when interest rates go down,
Yeah.
what do people generally borrow for, or is it also just the everyday stuff like using credit cards and for whatever it is?
Yeah, I think definitely the essentially everything that's on offer. That's shown at the moment by the amount that credit card debt has increased. That's the comparison that I was drawing there. But
Okay.
yeah, like I say, it's not all bad. You know, if interest rates are low, then you do get people. You should get people starting more businesses. You should get people doing home improvements to their house, or being able to afford a mortgage. Because if interest rates were double or triple what they are, which isn't historically that strange, it would be pretty difficult. I don't think I would be able to afford the mortgage that we have if the interest rates, or certainly my monthly payments, doubled or tripled. And I'm sure a lot of other people would find themselves in that situation. So yes, I would say on the whole, interest rates go down. Generally, people will borrow for whatever purpose.
So what's your theory then? Back to sort of your feelings then about, I mentioned the sort of the fact that inflation doesn't really go up much, but people can borrow the same amount, but they don't have to pay back as much. So I guess if interest rates are low and inflation is low, for the average person, it's like, great, I'm spending less. So yeah, I guess you carry on sort of what you
not just for the everyday person either. So interest rates are set centrally in the UK. In any case, are set centrally by the Bank of England, and that's an independent function away from Parliament, which again is another point, but it's an important one, so that there can't be political motivations for setting the interest rate, although that sometimes feeds in and is reported on pretty widely, and certainly in the US, where Trump has kind of been pretty vocal about what he thinks that the interest rates should be. But coming back to that, it's not just the consumer that's going to benefit from cheap debt. It's also the small businesses, the medium businesses, the larger ones, and ultimately the government and their institutions, their state bodies. So my personal theory is that we are so indebted as a world that it may well, I think it's pretty plausible that you are seeing lower and lower interest rates, because that ultimately allows the government to repay less in terms of what the interest is on the debt that they're borrowing.
Right. Okay. And in terms of like the Bank of England controlling interest rate, so is that for the whole country then? Do they have to can they set like a limit for how? Because obviously banks are like private institutions. Can they just say across the board it can't go above this amount, the interest rates type thing? Or?
So they set what's called the base rate, which is the minimum effectively that you would see referenced. So when you go to, the easiest way to relate it for people listening will be, if you have a mortgage, you will generally pay base plus an amount, and that amount is the cost of the bank's financing, because they don't borrow at that base rate level because they're borrowing from other banks. That covers their cost, and then obviously their revenue on top of that.
Right. So a lot of these institutions are sort of debt upon debt type thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I used to work for a very large global bank, and one of their biggest customers was themselves, because banks spend a lot of their time, borrowing money from each other to finance things that they investments that they want to do. It's I don't necessarily know how understood it is by people, but that is effectively what a bank will try and achieve.
Okay. So what's your theory of this then? What's your sort of, I guess you sort of seem to be alluding to it before, but like maybe a more positive way forward that we could be handling all of this?
You mean the global economy?
Yeah.
Generally?
Well,
Yeah.
you were sort of talking about your theory, or have you already laid it out? And you were sort of talking
No,
about
no. And if I haven't done it very, very well. But No, I think that, and I'm going to take time to introduce another acronym and concept, which is GDP, which we see reported on all the time, and quite a lot of the time, if the media is saying growth, that is generally GDP that they are referring to, which is effectively it is the sum of the value of the goods and services which a country produces within its borders. And again, it's had a few iterations and additions to it. The interesting thing about GDP is that it was created again, the best part of 100 years ago, I think, as a way that countries in the wake of World War II could sort of pit themselves against one another, but also to say, right, well, France needs to rebuild. How can we, what security have we got? Because France has been, decimated by the Nazis. We can say, well, they produce this amount on an annual basis, and on that basis, we'll lend to them, sort of like that being their security.
Right.
And knowing that they do produce that much, so they're sort of good for the money, if that makes sense. And at the time, you had concepts like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were being created in order to fund a lot of this building.
So almost like these countries represent the person that goes into a bank and tries to justify why the bank should loan him money, whereas with France, for example, they're trying to justify to the rest of the world why they should be loaned money.
Exactly, right. and that still happens. So GDP was a really neat way of saying, this is how good this country is year on year. They've increased their GDP by 4 or 5%, and China's probably the leading light in that sense at the moment. They've got really high, comparatively really high GDP, and that must mean that they're improving as a country year on year. The negative thing about GDP is that it misses out on so many other things that we think are important. So I don't know if it's I don't know if you've seen this already today, but there was a piece in the news about Marcus Rashford writing to MPs and talking about free school meals. That being cut over the summer months, because normally that wouldn't be in place for kids over the summer. But of course, with coronavirus at the moment, a lot of kids are still going to be at home are going to be in school over the summer period.
Yeah, I think I caught a bit of Keir Starmer mentioning it in the Prime Minister's questions about that.
Yeah. And broadly, that's about the welfare system, but GDP makes no provision for welfare. So you might look at some countries like some of the Nordics and Scandinavian countries who have great welfare systems, but that doesn't necessarily feed through to their GDP. I think the most famous, I guess, contrarian country when it comes to GDP is Bhutan. It's fairly widely reported that they don't measure themselves by GDP growth. They measure themselves using a happiness index, it's a really novel way of doing things. A lot of people, a lot of the detractors of that type of a method would say that it's very, happiness is ultimately subjective, which is of course true. But that sort of a concept, I think, and coming back around to what is my worldview, that sort of a concept of baking in these general principles, which I think, broadly speaking, everybody agrees on. To quote Marcus Rashford today, he said, from whatever side of the political, I'm paraphrasing, but whatever side of the political landscape you're on, can't we just agree that no child should be hungry? Well, of course, most people would agree with that. So I think my general view is that whether you're blue or red, whether you're Republican, Democrat, whatever you prescribe to, there are certain things that every single person thinks is important, and there must be a better way of doing things than just focusing on growing our country as a a means to an end.
Yeah, sure. So why? I mean, it seems completely sensible to me, and I've heard these sort of things before. I guess a lot of confusion starts of like, well, why hasn't it happened already? Where is, why aren't why isn't it happening politically, and why hasn't it happened already? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think ultimately that you've got a lot of power and wealth concentrated in a few, relatively speaking, a few people,
Mm,
and what that does, of course, with those things is it comes being able to serve your interests, and ultimately, unfortunately, the interests of one's shareholder if you're a company. Um, which a good example of that would be so coming back round to the interest rates and borrowing and debt and that kind of thing. After 2008, 2009, and is currently happening at the moment, a lot of countries engaged in a form of what's called monetary expansion. So increasing the amount of money in the economy, whether you wanted to call that quantitative easing, as they did in America. I think that's what they call it in America or Europe. I can't actually remember, but effectively, it's a crude way of injecting money into the economy by allowing banks to borrow very, very cheaply, but ultimately trying to get that into the hands of people
mm,
on boots on the ground, and giving them more money to spend so that they can go out and increase consumer spending, and then employment will go up, and all of these great things will come as a result of that. The reality was actually quite different. One of the major criticisms of that program was that what you had was a lot of banks being able to lend cheaply, but lending that money to companies who then didn't really have anything to do with it. So instead of allocating, and obviously speaking in general terms, but instead of allocating that money to new investment or good new investment, or increasing their workforce or improving their technology, a lot of companies engaged in what are called stock buybacks, which you may have heard of, but in simple terms would be where a company goes into the stock market and buys back its own shares. And what this does is effectively increase the share price, which the only person that it ultimately will benefit, not the only person, but certainly the majority of the benefit will go to the shareholder, of course, because their value is increased. So that's a good example of where actually the purpose of the program, if you like, wasn't being adhered to
so
quite so well.
just to sort of pick apart what you say, and
Sure.
if I'm wrong, let me know.
No, sorry, there was a lot.
So you think that, in simple terms, your theory for why we haven't changed to, let's say, a more, because you're not looking to replace GDP. You just think it's extremely limited, and there needs to be all these other factors that come
Yeah.
into play, like how healthy, how the child mortality rate, or how whatever else it is, how well educated the people are, and crime rates and things like that. All these other things of just overall well-being of a country, and the reason you think that it hasn't changed is, I guess, a more cynical approach of saying that there's too many powerful people that would lose out if it started to change.
Yeah, I would say so. I think that wealth redistribution is probably one of the most important things that you'll see maybe coming to a head in the next 10 or 20 years. I'm not a socialist by any means, but I don't think it's outrageous for us to say the fact that you know whole countries' value is held in the hand of one person.
Mm,
For example, that quite often gets trotted out as a statistic of Elon Musk is worth X, and that's the same amount as the GDP of a country. I don't think that's right. I think it's right that people with great ideas should be compensated appropriately for those ideas, but I don't think it's right that that should happen. And then at the bottom end of the spectrum, kids are going without lunches, and people aren't getting opportunities.
Sure. Okay. Well, just to play devil's advocate for a moment,
Yeah.
what about when you take someone like Bill Gates, like someone who has amassed an unbelievable fortune? And on the face of it, you think, well, he shouldn't have this much money. Well, him and his family shouldn't have this much
Mm.
money. But the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, like the amount they've done for the global poor. I mean, I know there's a lot of conspiracies out there that
Yeah.
they're injecting people with diseases and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that. But I think my view is that they are trying to do as much good as they can with their massive amount of wealth.
Yeah.
So do you not feel that the people like this, like the way I've sort of changed over the years? So I used to be a lot more left wing, but then it was people like Bill Gates that made me think, well, it's not always an issue someone having a lot of money,
Hmm.
like a horrendous amount of money. It's getting it into the right people's hands, and it's the right people. It's when bad people have a lot of money.
Hmm.
So I guess where sort of, I know you mentioned you're not a socialist or anything like that, but I guess the problem with sort of this redistribution type idea is that people like Bill Gates, who are extremely smart but also extremely motivated to help people,
Yeah.
he wouldn't have the resources to do as much good as he's done if it was redistributed earlier on.
Yeah.
What's your sort of thoughts on that?
No, I agree with you entirely, and I think if everybody did prescribe to a similar mindset as the foundation that they run, and the work that they've done, for sure, that would be fantastic. I
Mm,
think I think where I come at it from is that I hold a central view that people are so um, affected by their um, start in life.
yeah.
Um, I heard a horrendous statistic the other day that I can't recall the actual numbers within it, but it's something like we expel X amount of children from school every year in the UK, and a unacceptable amount of those children will go on to go into prison.
Mm,
And it's things like that um, I can't. There's one side of the argument, which is you can work as hard as you can work, and if you set your mind to it, you're going to achieve whatever you want to achieve. And absolutely, hard work is a really important thing, and it's something that we should all prescribe to. But
mm,
at the same time, it's often those people with that view who don't accept all of the incredibly important controlling factors
mm,
that govern who you are. If you're born into a single parent family, if you're born in a certain postcode, if you're born in all of these things, that I just think it's so unfair that just because you're a human being that was born here as opposed to being born there, and because you didn't have this opportunity or you didn't have this great teacher, that you didn't get the same opportunity. So whatever that ends up looking like in terms of wealth redistribution, I know um, there's lots of methods that are talked about and mooted. One of those is universal basic income, which I've heard you sort of briefly touch on in a previous podcast. Whatever that looks like, I just think that there's a better way of doing what we're
sure.
what we're doing at the moment.
Well, I mean, to switch out my devil's advocate mode, because I agree with
Mm,
most, like pretty much everything you're saying. I think just to add to it, I think this whole thing of working hard is ridiculous, to be honest. Whenever I
mm,
talk to someone who has this sort of view of how they got their money, um, of course it's a factor, but if you judged your success on by how hard you worked, then the people in these low income countries like Nepal, where I spent quite a few months, these women who are out in the fields slogging like 12, 13 hours a day, who are working very hard.
Exactly.
By that standard, they would be the richest people on earth, and
Yeah.
it's just not the case. And I think this whole working hard thing it's important when you're talking on an individual level, and if someone doesn't have a good work ethic, or but you can't tell someone who's grown up in an extremely I don't know how to say underprivileged household, whatever
Yeah.
country that is in, or even in a country such as this, which is an extremely wealthy country, where they've grown up with abuse, where they've grown up with, and that caused mental health problems, and they've grown up with no money. They've been malnourished because their parents can't afford the right food for them. You can't tell these people even when they get to an adult stage, when they're 25, 30 or whatever, just to say to them, well, you should have just worked harder. Working hard, it's just so limited in its view. And I guess that's how, it ties back in with what you're saying. So how do you think on a macro scale, on a bigger level, you think that including health and all these other different factors to judge how well a country is doing, how do you think that will affect sort of the running of things, or this sort of inequality we see?
Well, I'd like to think that I think people are quite good at responding to objectives and targets generally. That if instead of, I heard a great podcast with a lady, an economist called Kate Rayworth, who is probably the foremost thinker in terms of what I'm saying. She has a book called Donut Economics, which is this idea that instead of the GDP growth just going up and that being that being the best thing in the world, what if you went to the doctor and you were told that you had a growth? That's how she thinks of it. You can't just grow all the time. And she said something on a podcast I was listening to, which was, wouldn't it be great if instead of having in Times Square in New York, instead of having share prices rotating around the building, why don't they put up the health of the rainforests, or how much carbon New York produced that day, or how many kids were lifted out of poverty, or how what the literacy rates are of certain places. Which all of these things are, again, if you cross the political divide, and climate change deniers aside, I think if you cross the political divide, these are things that people would say, yes, I want my children to be able to read. And I think that other children should be able to read. And I think that children should be brought up outside of poverty. But yeah, I mean, chances are that overall, the wealth would be less concentrated. It's not like we don't have enough money to do certain things. A great example is, well, we've seen 10 years of austerity, and then all of a sudden we've got some of the biggest globally, some of the biggest programs of investment that governments have ever engaged in, and some of those are amazing and have been long needed in a lot of instances. And you've got people on, I think, both sides saying, well, why weren't we doing this earlier? Why haven't we been allocating the funds to do that? And that's a complex issue in itself. But I think that the concept of what I'm saying is that it's ultimately about choices. If you want to choose to spend X amount sending people to space, that's fine. Do that, but don't do it at the expense of kids not being able to read. I think that's the best way that I can describe it.
Yeah, sure. And it's this psychology, I guess, of if people are, like you said, with the, Times Square stuff, once people start, governments and just the general public start to actually measure their success
Yeah.
by a much wider variety of factors, or see or I can see that is being done, then people bring that into their own lives. There's more than enough people out there who just are so focused on money that it's not beneficial to them as a person, and I guess it would.
Yeah.
As a country, then that's the same thing. It benefits that country to really recognize what's actually good for that country over the long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what? How would donut economics, like what are some of the policies, or what are some of the ideas that she lays out in the book, or that you would promote? Like what sort of things does she talk about?
Well, I actually haven't read the book. I've only listened to the podcast.
Okay.
I have it. I don't know how you do your reading, but I have basically bought 20 books that I haven't read yet, because I'm still reading the 20 that I bought, a few weeks ago or a few months ago, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, essentially, UBI would be a big part of it.
So UBI is universal basic income.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think, when you say I'm going to give £1,000 a month to whoever, people all of a sudden balk at the idea and go, well, I pay way more tax than this person, and I therefore either I don't want it, or they don't deserve it because I've contributed more to the economy. But the thing is, and again, coming back to Marcus Rashford, he said it really clearly in his interview with the BBC that his mum was so preoccupied with working out where their next meals were going to come from. How on earth are you supposed to think about starting a business or training yourself up to go and work in another industry that might be more remunerative for you? And Akala speaks very well on this topic as well, and very similar points. But I think that if you take that, so a good example of this actually is thinking back to when we spoke earlier about some of the programs that were in place in the US and the UK and Europe and Japan and some other countries where they were effectively giving money out for free to the banks and trying to get them to trickle it down the economy. Why not just give it to the people that you want to spend the money in the first place? What's the reticence? If that's the end game, what's the difference between doing that? Do you think that the banks will control it better? Well, I think they've possibly been shown to have not been able to in the past. My take on it is that if that's an idea and it's been tested, which it has, it's been tested in lots of different places and is currently undergoing testing in lots of other places as well. If it works, well enough, why not just give it a go?
Yeah. And I guess that's the more conservative view of like not wanting to give this stuff a go, because it's like, well, we've got to do what we think works or has worked in the past, or obviously it hasn't worked, it's not working to its full extent, so we need to do some sort of change. I'll just sort of jump in with sort of my sort of recent learning of universal basic income. So what it basically is giving people, no matter what, I'll just use one of the examples. So £1,000 a month. So you give every single person in the country £1,000 a month. I think there might be a limit. I think if you're earning like over an extreme amount, then maybe don't. But let's just say it goes to everyone. And my feeling of this was like, well, I stayed away from learning about it for a while just because I hadn't got around to it, and I was just thinking, well, it just plays into this right-wing idea that if you give people money, they work less. They'll just sit on their laurels, and there's no need to work because they're getting money, and therefore the economy will suffer, and then things will start to go downhill. but I listened to, which for me is probably my favorite ever, Joe Rogan podcast, but it's with a guy called Andrew Yang. And I sort of metaphorically had my jaw wide open for the whole 2 hours, whatever they speak, because he is so. He's a guy in America. He's an American guy who ran for president, and he was pushing this universal basic income. And some of the key points that jumped out to me were so he comes from a position of AI and the fact that it's already taking jobs. So in American context, I don't know how much it's affecting here. I'd love to hear more English people talking about sort of universal basic income and sort of learning about how AI is affecting jobs in this country. But in the context he was given, sort of like the Rust Belt or the poorer parts and more manufacturing, industrial parts of America, AI is already taken over. So there's in warehouses and stuff, it's already happened. People have lost their jobs in the sort of states and areas that voted for Trump because they had nothing. They're just like, we need change, we need something. You can imagine working in a warehouse and you're putting stuff together and it's on a conveyor belt. Now, there's just machines. They do it quicker. They do it more effectively. They do it and a hell of a lot cheaper. So that's already happened. So that was one thing for me where I was like, oh, because I always thought of, I heard about this thing with AI and I was like, just thinking, well, it's just a bit of dystopian like science fiction, and yeah, it's bad, but it's not going to be that bad. And then he talks about truckers in New York and how self-driving trucks and stuff. And the thing is, in these towns where these machines are taking over, or in these towns where the main jobs in that area the machines are taking over, everything goes downhill. Suddenly the unemployment, domestic violence goes up, mental health problems go up, alcohol abuse, just all the bad stuff just starts to happen because people don't have a job, they don't have money, and if they don't have money. So that was one thing that I thought, oh wow, okay, I think I need to learn more about technology and how it's not just a tool for good. It actually really could, not in the way of Terminator 2, but it could, in a very subtle way, just slowly edge out all these jobs. And the other thing was, I've lost it now. I might have to come back to that. There was another really good point with universal basic. Oh, that was it. How it's fed back into the economy instantly. So if you imagine these towns, let's just give an English town where let's just say a northern industrial town, and let's just leave robots and AI out of it. Let's just say there's an area where they're losing a lot of jobs, or it's just an impoverished area, which every country has. When you give people money, it's not like giving a millionaire £1,000, because what's that millionaire going to do with £1,000? They're not going to be like, oh sweet, I got this £1,000. What am I going to spend it on? What do I need? It's just going to go in probably an abroad like a foreign like bank account where it's getting a bit of interest or whatever. If you give someone who really is hand to mouth, like struggling every day, £1,000 a month, it's not going to change their lives for like massively. It's not going to make them like it's going to be a process. Not everyone can live on just £1,000 because of their families or whatever, but that is going to go straight back into the economy because they're going to be going straight to the supermarket. They're going to be buying all the food they can have. They're going to be paying their rent on time. That all of this stuff will get fed straight back in. And that was another thing where I thought, oh, wow, I hadn't actually thought about that. I mean, it's so obvious, but if you give £1,000 to people who really, really need it, it will, in all likeliness, go back into the economy. I guess the only thing I'd be skeptical about, which doesn't mean we shouldn't give it a go, because I feel like we definitely should, but it's just sort of people with substance abuses and things like that. I don't personally give to homeless on the street. I think that money should go to homeless organisations who I think I feel more comfortable that they'll be able to decide how best to use that money.
Yeah.
But there is an issue with substance abuse, especially people from impoverished backgrounds. So that's the only area where I can see some of that money going down the drain. But I think that is such a small thing for the amount of good it would do. I was pretty, from going very skeptical, just from listening
Yeah.
to that Andrew Yang podcast. I became like, wow, okay, this is really something we need to look at.
And I'm glad you brought up the substance abuse point, actually. So I read a book a few years ago called Utopia for Realists, which is by a Dutch economist, which I would recommend to anybody. But it's effectively about the idea that we've sort of stopped believing in utopia. We've just got to a point where everything is so easy for us that we're not actually pushing on to try and get to the to get to the good stuff. And what he means by that when he says that is rather than the good stuff being super yachts and that kind of thing, it's actually exactly what we've been talking about. So ending child poverty and literacy rates and that sort of stuff. Why aren't we trying to do that for everybody in the world, rather than again coming back to this GDP point, gunning for this just imaginary growth all of the time, which we think is going to fix everything, fix all of the ills of society. I'm conscious that I may have come across as a touch on the cynical side, but I do genuinely think that there's a lot of good out of UBI, which as you pointed out, and substance abuse is actually in some of the research that's been done, some of the smaller scale stuff in the US, where they've taken 30 individuals who are living on the street. A lot of them are suffering with substance abuse, and they've given them X amount per month. My initial reaction would be, well, we know where that's going, quite as you've pointed out. But actually, in I think all but one of the cases, and it was it's a caveat of quite a small trial that he quotes. But in all but one of the cases, they'd ended up living in permanent accommodation off their own bat, in quotation marks, obviously as a direct result of what they'd been given. I think the vast majority of them had stayed sober for X period of time. But the critical thing there, so there were lots of other really good benefits from it, but the critical thing there was that they didn't just hand them £1,000 a month. They gave them £1,000 a month, and they helped them in lots of other ways. They gave them access to, substance abuse clinics and helped them put together CVs and that sort of stuff, which we would say is pretty basic stuff, actually. And a lot of those, ultimately, if you take the right wing view on this, well, they would want every single member of society to be functioning as an economic machine, producing as much as you possibly want in society. So why wouldn't you support that? I get that you might think, well, as you pointed out, they're just going to use it on prostitutes or whatever the negative vice is. But perhaps if the support was there for those people, that might not actually be the case. I just think it's important to do all the other bits around the outside at the same time that we would probably say is quite normal anyway.
Yeah, and I think one thing that you said very early on was these sort of 200 years, 100 years old, even 50 years old things that I feel that is by definition surely the more conservative way of thinking, and that's why I don't like to put a label on myself, but I feel like my views are more liberal because I think there are some views that are more conservative that I have, but on the whole, I feel a lot more liberal because I think there are benefits to conservatism and traditionalism, but the downside, which I think you've highlighted really well, is if we don't challenge, like truly challenge, not just go, oh, this is not great, or you can imagine bringing this conversation up with someone like Boris Johnson, or well, there's no point talking to Trump, but someone a bit more, who is more conservative, that oh, we'll look into that, and then it's, but actually these fundamental things that are so entrenched and have just been going for so long, we need to properly scrutinize them and pull them apart and go, right, what's good in them, what works. So GDP, there is good in GDP, and we need to know how much people are spending and how much people are earning, and all that sort of stuff is really good. But what else can we do to improve upon this? And I think, that's the problems I have with more traditional and conservative way of thinking. It's just that dynamism that we need, that sort of moving forward and trying stuff out, especially when it's been like that long a time. But yeah.
I think it's important. I think the main thing is to try and cross the divide. We're not doing a tremendous job of it right now, because I think we are broadly agreeing on everything that we're saying. But these types of conversations that people have. Joe Rogan's a really good example of that. I think he gets whoever he possibly can onto his podcast, and he has lots of people with lots of differing views, and I think he's got a genuine thirst to try and understand where people are coming from, and try and express that to his listening public as succinctly and clearly as he can. I just don't think that happens enough. I think that you have people on both the right and left of politics in the world who are so deeply entrenched in their views, and they probably don't know why, and they don't end up talking to each other. I know you've talked about echo chambers on a previous podcast, but I do think it's such a massive issue.
Sorry to jump in. What do you think causes? What do you think some of the factors that fuel this? I know, terms of tribalism, it's a biological thing, and we've had it forever. But what do you think as keeping or fueling some of this continued tribalism, or making it stronger and making us feel so divided, and people have these entrenched views that they don't want to challenge or discuss at length?
I think maybe a combination of two main things that I can think of. One would be, coming back to economics, it would be something in what we would say is behavioural economics, which is more of a modern concept, but it's effectively all about the different types of biases that we have as people, and they go further than just economics. It's in everyday life, but one of those things that I always bring up is confirmation bias, which I'm sure you know what it is, but for anybody that doesn't, it's where you go out and seek information that just further goes to confirm exactly what you think. You can also then highlight that with recency bias, which is you putting the most amount of emphasis on what you've heard or read most recently. So you combine those two things together, and if all you're hearing about is we should invade a country, and that was your view anyway, and you are going out and looking for articles which support that view, well, then you're probably not going to change your mind.
No.
So I think there's that combined with what social media companies have got to take some level of responsibility for, which is showing people differing views. If they can work out algorithms to listen to what I'm saying and put adverts on my timeline or whatever, then they can work out an algorithm to say, right, this person defines themselves as a UKIP voter in their bio. They follow a load of Brexit news and people that are big in that space. Well, let's mix it up for them. Let's try and show them a little bit of everything, and that goes on both sides.
You're saying that they don't do that, basically.
I don't think so. Not from what I've heard. I think I'm a fairly balanced individual. I also don't use social media a huge amount, but I I don't see that in my own life, and I haven't heard it happening. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I've heard this issue coming up over and over again.
Well, I guess
And
that's
you can see it in Facebook comments, right? If you go on something that's inflammatory, particularly in the local media, if you go on something inflammatory on either side of the debate, Brexit's the easy one because that's what's going on at the moment. But you just see these people with. I hate to liken it back to the Brexiteer view of things, but because I think I don't want to get into it as a result of this, but if you see a negative comment from somebody that's saying, we don't want foreign people in the UK, the amount of times that person has, will follow a page like Britain First, or have a Union Jack as their background. All of these things combine together, which are individual data points, but for you can pretty much predict what a person's gonna think.
Yeah. So I guess what you're sort of saying, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is basically so you said confirmation bias, which is a psychological thing of like, it's something you can notice in yourself. So it's coming up with, it's your opinion and then finding all the reasons to support that opinion, as opposed to the science or the perfect scientific way of doing things of finding the evidence and then coming up with an opinion, or having an opinion, then trying to disprove that opinion, and then seeing how much it holds up to scrutiny, and then making your decision. So that's the psychological one. But it seems what you're saying with the social media is it's playing into that psychological thing with the way they do things. And I would include in that something that's a lot older than social media is stuff like tabloids. It's this, it's clickbait before clickbait became a thing. It's the big headlines saying, whatever it is, foreigners must go, for example. And then people are fueled into this way of thinking and this echo chamber. So it seems like what you're saying is it's the psychological thing that we should all be aware of and notice within ourselves and try to remedy that. But also it's these outside institutions that really try to really work against any effort to combat confirmation bias, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I'd add a third in, which is definitely on the psychological side, which is just pure comfort as well. I think people feel comfortable. It is a very uncomfortable feeling to have an entrenched view, discuss it, and then go, well, actually, what I've believed my entire life, I no longer believe, and I'm going to come out and say that in public. I think that's a big deal. But then, conscious not to be overly cynical and pessimistic about it, because it's just too easy. If you actually look at, Joe Rogan's podcast is the biggest podcast in the world, and people like Sam Harris,
LBC now is
LBC, and all of these are good examples of having really balanced. Sam Harris in particular. He's so fierce in wanting to root out the actual facts of something and try and understand. People like, well, I was going to say James O'Brien, but then I know there's some listeners, one in particular that I can think of, who's not gonna like that example. But I do think that people like that, who have a genuine thirst to seek out the truth and the facts in a situation.
Sure.
Before they make their minds up, that sort of a thing is actually probably more prevalent than we're giving it credit for. It's just that bit on the fringes where I think we need to do a better job of bringing those people together, and then trying to get them to find some common ground.
Yeah, and I think what it shows is there, like you said, of it being the biggest podcast in the world, there is a thirst. And I don't think it's a new thirst. I think it's a thirst that's always been there, but maybe the platform, if you're just, that's why, I'm so grateful for the BBC. There's a lot that can be said about BBC, and you can never have 100% unbiased, but I'd rather have the BBC on the TV as the number one news station than be in America with Fox and CNN and MSNBC, where...
Agreed.
Do you know what I mean? It's we're very lucky, I think, to have the BBC and had it for so long. And And I think there's always that need in people, I think subconscious, and I'm making a generalization, but I feel like it's more of a natural interaction, isn't it? And Joe Rogan criticizes just TV now, like news channels, because of the time. So the problem with headlines, the problem with clickbait is it's too simplistic. And with news channels, when they've got an interview with someone, they've got like 10 minutes to interview them, and they've got to be quick, and there's no nuance. Whereas people, I think if it's a subject they really love, even though it's just sport, so if you have two people chatting about sport for a long time, that becomes really interesting to someone, and hearing different sides of the argument. Whereas if you just like see a single sentence about why this team is awful or why this manager did this, then it just feeds into this sort of fighting and mentality. So I think you're right. I think it is a good thing that and I think we should be supporting the outlets that are sort of, that's probably part of the reason that I wanted to do this, but I really value those sort of outlets, and I think more and more people are, and it would be nice to see these other outlets that aren't as nuanced and sort of decline a bit, which would be good.
Yeah, I'd agree. Although I did find out recently that, and I don't have any more information than what I'm about to say, but I did find out recently that the UK actually ranks pretty low on press freedoms, which I don't know how much specifically that would be to do with the BBC, although it obviously makes up a large part of the press in the UK. But I mean, we're 35th in the world in terms of our press freedom, and that's behind countries like South Africa, Ghana, and Liechtenstein and Samoa, which I was really surprised to hear that, because I, like you, I think we have it pretty good, apart from some select tabloids that will remain nameless. We have some of the tenets of investigative journalism. In the Guardian, for example, is a tremendous organisation, and has shown it in terms of what it's tried to uncover in the world and what it's taught people. Yes, there's a lot that can be said for it in some other ways, but ultimately it's a private entity that's owned by a foundation and always has been. It doesn't answer to any shareholders, and as I say, it's uncovered some really important stuff in the world. So I've always carried that view as well, but I did find that surprising. I would want to know more about why.
Yeah, I looked up recently. I should have written a lot of it down, but I think some of it as well was there was like certain things where journalists were treated poorly, and then there was no sort of repercussions for the people that treated them that low, like violence against journalists. So I think that it's quite nuanced with what they look at. I've forgotten the name of the website that sort of look into it. But yeah, I guess if you type in press freedom or something,
I think it's the Reporters Without Borders.
That's it. Yes, yeah. And it was just a classic case of when I saw the list, it was like, oh yeah, of course, who's at the top, and it's all Scandinavian countries.
Yeah,
just for once, I'd like to see Norway near the bottom of that list. But yeah, no, it is surprising, and I'm fascinated as to why that is, and what constitutes good press freedom. I'd like to go into that now, but to be honest, we're running out of time, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more to chat about next time.
Yeah, sure.
Would you be happy to do another one?
Oh yeah, definitely. As I say, this is something that I think is really important, and I've benefited hugely personally from podcasts. Some that I've mentioned just there, and that sort of thirst for wanting to know more and trying to test my views and opinions. And I've moved a lot on certain things over the last few years, and I can only see that as a positive. And if I can sort of contribute that and contribute to that in any tiny way, I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's been great. It's yeah, I think the stuff at the start we talked about was really, really interesting. And there's things that hopefully people that didn't switch off after you said you studied economics, the people that are actually interested to find out these things would have stayed on. I think, you know, I learned something from it, and I hope other people will too. And then the discussions we had. So yeah, and I will say to anyone out there, what I love, and I'm sure you'd be the same, Phil, is people with strong opinions. So if anyone's got a strong opinion about any of the stuff we discussed or anything else, please give me an email, danjbrownuk@gmail.com. It'd be great to have you on to voice your strong opinion and get it out there. And maybe I'll challenge it, maybe I'll agree. But yeah, just thanks a lot, Phil. It's been really good.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for your time, Dan.
Okay, take it easy.
Cheers.